They called them the Invincibles. For over a decade, no army on Earth could stand against them. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's legendary Old Guard, had never tasted defeat, never retreated, never failed. These giants in bearskin caps had crushed the armies of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. They had marched victorious through every major capital of Europe except one. When Napoleon committed the Guard, the battle was already over. Enemy soldiers would throw down their weapons at the mere sight of those towering black fur caps approaching through the smoke. 6 feet of disciplined French muscle. Veterans of 50 battles. Survivors of the Russian winter. The most elite fighting force the world had ever seen. But on June 18, 1815, something impossible happened on a muddy Belgian battlefield. The invincible Imperial Guard was systematically, brutally, and completely destroyed. Here's what they don't want you to know. This wasn't a heroic last stand. This wasn't a close battle decided by luck. This was a calculated execution. A military massacre so shocking that European powers spent generations trying to bury the truth. The British didn't just defeat Napoleon's elite troops. They didn't just outfight them. They annihilated them using a systematic killing machine specifically designed to destroy French military superiority forever. Tonight, we're uncovering the forbidden truth about Waterloo that changed the course of human civilization. How 4,000 legendary warriors who had never known defeat were lured into the most sophisticated death trap in military history. How the British Empire deliberately shattered the myth of French invincibility through methodical, ruthless, and utterly devastating military science. Welcome to History Bedtime Stories. I'm your narrator, and tonight, we're diving deep into one of history's most shocking military massacres. A story so brutal that even Wellington himself would later call it the nearest run thing you ever saw. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple way to support the channel. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time are you joining me tonight. So, I would really love to hear from you in the comments. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Waterloo, you must first understand what the Old Guard represented. This wasn't just another military unit. This was the embodiment of French military excellence, revolutionary ideals, and Napoleon's personal genius rolled into the most elite fighting force Europe had ever witnessed. The Imperial Guard began as the Consular Guard in 1799, when Napoleon was still First Consul of France. But even in those early days, Bonaparte understood something that his enemies would learn to their cost. Elite troops aren't just better soldiers, they're psychological weapons. Picture the requirements to join the Guard. You had to be at least 5 feet 8 inches tall, massive for the 18th century when the average height was barely 5 feet 4 inches. You needed at least 4 years of active military service with distinguished conduct. You had to be able to read and write, revolutionary for common soldiers. And most importantly, you needed to have been personally approved by Napoleon himself. These weren't just soldiers. They were carefully selected specimens of French military might. What made the Old Guard truly unique wasn't just their fighting ability. It was their status within Napoleon's empire. They received double pay compared to regular infantry. They were exempt from punishment by officers other than Napoleon himself. They had their own bakeries, their own hospitals, their own elite culture. Napoleon called them mes enfants, my children, and like an indulgent father, he showered them with privileges that made other troops both envious and reverent. The Old Guard could complain directly to the emperor about conditions, hence their nickname Les Grognards, the grumblers. Try to imagine. Common soldiers who could literally grumble to the Emperor of France and get away with it. But these privileges came with an understanding. absolute loyalty, absolute excellence, and absolute victory. From 1804 to 1815, the Imperial Guard participated in every major Napoleonic campaign. Austerlitz, where they smashed the combined armies of Austria and Russia. Jena Auerstedt, where they obliterated Prussian military power. Friedland, where they taught the Russians the meaning of French tactical superiority. Wagram, where they proved that Austrian resilience was no match for French elan. Campaign after campaign, battle after battle, the Old Guard never, and I mean never, failed to achieve their objective. When Napoleon committed the Guard, the battle was over. Their very presence on a battlefield was often enough to cause enemy formations to break before contact. Consider this: in over 50 major engagements across 11 years of continuous warfare, the Imperial Guard had never been defeated. Not once. They hadn't just won battles, they had defined what victory looked like. The iconic bearskin caps weren't just ceremonial, they were psychological warfare. Standing 6 feet tall with their caps, these giants appeared superhuman to 18th century soldiers. The bear fur came from Russian bears, symbolizing their victory over the Tsar's armies. Every element of their uniform was designed to intimidate. Picture the effect on enemy soldiers. You're a British redcoat, maybe 5 feet 5 inches if you're lucky, carrying a musket that might fire twice a minute if you're skilled. Suddenly, across the battlefield, you see a line of giants approaching. 6 feet of disciplined French muscle topped with massive black fur caps. Behind them marches the man who conquered Europe. Many armies broke before the Guard even reached musket range. But even within the Imperial Guard, there were hierarchies of excellence. The Grenadiers à Pied, the Foot Grenadiers, were the senior regiment, recruited from veterans of at least 10 years' service. Then came the Chasseurs à Pied, slightly younger but equally deadly. The Middle Guard included regiments like the Fusiliers Grenadiers, still elite but not quite at the legendary status of the Old Guard. At the very pinnacle stood the 1st Regiment of Grenadiers à Pied. These were Napoleon's personal bodyguards, veterans of every campaign, survivors of the retreat from Moscow, winners at Leipzig when everyone else was losing. If the Imperial Guard was elite, the 1st Grenadiers were legendary. Perhaps most importantly, the Old Guard had developed what military historians call institutional invincibility, a collective belief system where defeat was literally unthinkable. They didn't just expect to win. They knew they would win because they had never done anything else. This wasn't arrogance. This was the confidence born from a decade of absolute success. When you've broken the back of Austrian, Russian, Prussian, and Spanish armies repeatedly, when you've marched victorious through every major capital of Europe except London, when your mere presence on a battlefield has become synonymous with certain victory, defeat becomes psychologically impossible. The Old Guard didn't just fight for France. They fought for the revolution, for meritocracy, for the idea that common men could rise to greatness through excellence rather than birth. They were living proof that the old aristocratic order was dead. Until June 18, 1815. March 1, 1815. A single ship appears off the coast of Cannes in southern France. Aboard, Napoleon Bonaparte escaped from exile on the island of Elba, along with a handful of loyal soldiers. The Congress of Vienna had divided up his empire among the crowned heads of Europe. They thought the Corsican upstart was finished. They were catastrophically wrong. What happened next has become the stuff of legend. As Napoleon marched north toward Paris, entire regiments of the Royal Army sent to stop him instead threw down their weapons and joined his cause. Marshal Ney, who had promised King Louis XVIII that he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, took one look at his former emperor and immediately surrendered his entire command. But most importantly for our story, the the surviving members of the Imperial Guard began converging on Paris from across France. These were the men who had followed Napoleon through the disaster of Russia, who had fought magnificently at Leipzig even in defeat, who had performed miracles during the brilliant 1814 campaign in France itself. They came back to their emperor not just as soldiers, but as believers in a cause they thought had died forever. The reaction across Europe was immediate and panicked. Napoleon's return wasn't just a political crisis. It was an existential threat to the entire European order that had been painstakingly constructed after his first defeat. The Duke of Wellington, fresh from his victory in the Peninsular War, was appointed to command the Anglo-Dutch army in Belgium. Field Marshal Blücher, the aggressive Prussian general who had contributed significantly to Napoleon's defeat in 1814, was given command of the Prussian army. Together, they represented over 200,000 men dedicated to one purpose: the permanent destruction of Napoleon Bonaparte. But Wellington and Blücher understood something that earlier coalitions had failed to grasp. It wasn't enough to defeat Napoleon militarily. You had to destroy the myth of French invincibility. And that meant destroying the Imperial Guard. Napoleon found himself in an impossible strategic position. He commanded roughly 125,000 men, a respectable force, but not enough to face the combined might of Europe in a prolonged campaign. His enemies controlled the seas, cutting off reinforcements and supplies. Time was against him. Every month of delay would bring more Austrian and Russian armies into the field. His only hope was a lightning campaign to defeat the British and Prussian armies before they could unite, then march on Brussels and force a negotiated peace. It was a desperate gamble, but Napoleon had built his reputation on desperate gambles that somehow succeeded. Central to his entire strategy was the Imperial Guard. These 15,000 elite troops represented more than just his tactical reserve. They were his guarantee of victory. In every previous campaign, when regular troops had fought the enemy to exhaustion, the commitment of the Guard had always provided the decisive blow. The Imperial Guard that assembled in Paris in 1815 was different from the force that had marched into Russia in 1812. Many of the original grognards had died in the snows of the retreat or in the desperate fighting of 1813 to 1814. But Napoleon had worked feverishly to rebuild his elite force. Veterans who had survived the Russian campaign found themselves promoted to sergeant or officer ranks. Younger soldiers who had distinguished themselves in recent campaigns were selected for the Guard regiments. Most importantly, Napoleon had managed to reassemble the core of experienced NCOs who formed the backbone of the Guard's discipline and effectiveness. By June 1815, the Imperial Guard stood at approximately 15,000 men, organized into the Old Guard, Middle Guard, and Young Guard. The Old Guard itself, the most elite units, numbered about 4,000 veterans, including roughly 1,500 men in the 1st and 2nd Grenadiers à Pied and 1st and 2nd Chasseurs à Pied. These were the men who would face the British squares at Waterloo. On June 15, 1815, Napoleon's army crossed into Belgium with a speed and secrecy that caught Wellington and Blücher completely off guard. The Emperor's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Advance rapidly up the center line between the British and Prussian armies, defeat them separately before they could unite, then exploit the victory to sue for favorable peace terms. The Imperial Guard marched at the center of the French advance, their presence alone serving notice that this wasn't just another military operation. This was Napoleon's bid to reclaim his empire. As they marched through the Belgian countryside, witnesses reported that the Old Guard looked exactly as they had during the great campaigns of the past. The same disciplined formations, the same magnificent uniforms, the same aura of absolute confidence. They were veterans of Austerlitz and Friedland, survivors of Moscow and Leipzig. They had never lost a battle. They had no intention of starting now. Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, represented something entirely different from the romantic military genius of Napoleon. Where the French emperor was inspiration and innovation, Wellington was systematic precision. Where Napoleon relied on the elan of his troops and the brilliance of his tactical improvisations, Wellington had perfected something far more dangerous: a military system designed specifically to destroy French tactical superiority. Wellington's experience in the Peninsular War from 1808 to 1814 had taught him one crucial lesson. French tactical systems, no matter how brilliant, had exploitable weaknesses. The famous French attack columns that had dominated European battlefields for 2 decades were vulnerable to properly deployed British linear formations firing disciplined volleys. More importantly, Wellington had learned how to defeat the psychological impact of French elite troops. During the Peninsula, he had faced not the Imperial Guard itself, but other elite French formations. He had systematically dismantled their aura of invincibility through careful tactical preparation and disciplined execution. Now, at Waterloo, he would apply those lessons to Napoleon's most elite force. The British Army of 1815 was the product of nearly 20 years of continuous warfare against French forces. These weren't the hesitant, uncertain troops that had faced Napoleon's early victories. These were professionals who had perfected the art of killing Frenchmen. Consider the British infantry square, the formation that would prove decisive against the Imperial Guard. This wasn't just a defensive arrangement. It was a killing machine specifically designed to destroy cavalry and infantry attacks. For ranks deep on each side, the front rank kneeling with bayonets fixed, the rear ranks firing controlled volleys in rotation. Each British square could deliver devastating firepower. A typical battalion square of 500 men could fire approximately 2,000 rounds per minute in sustained combat. When the Imperial Guard advanced against these formations, they wouldn't be facing scattered resistance. They would be walking into a mathematical equation of destruction. The standard British infantry weapon was the land pattern musket, known affectionately as Brown Bess. In the hands of a trained British soldier, this weapon could fire 3 aimed shots per minute, 50% faster than most continental armies achieved. But the real advantage wasn't rate of fire, it was the systematic training that produced disciplined volley fire. British infantry had spent years perfecting the art of coordinated shooting. When a British battalion fired a volley, it wasn't 800 individual soldiers shooting. It was a single weapon firing 800 bullets simultaneously. This level of coordinated firepower had already proven devastating against French columns in Spain. At Waterloo, it would be directed against the finest troops France had ever produced. Wellington's army at Waterloo wasn't just British. It was a carefully integrated force of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, each positioned according to their strengths and the overall tactical plan. The Dutch and Belgians, many of whom had recently fought for Napoleon, held less critical positions. The German troops, particularly the King's German Legion, were veterans who could be trusted in crucial roles. But the backbone of the defense was provided by British and King's German Legion infantry formed into squares and positioned on the reverse slopes of Wellington's chosen ridge. This positioning, one of Wellington's signature tactical innovations, meant that French forces would have to advance uphill while under fire, only to discover the full extent of British defensive preparations at the last moment. Perhaps most importantly, Wellington understood the psychological dimension of warfare against the Imperial Guard. He had studied reports from every major Napoleonic battle, and he understood that the Guard's greatest weapon wasn't their tactical skill, it was their reputation. Wellington's response was characteristically methodical. He would systematically destroy that reputation through demonstration of British tactical superiority. The Guard's aura of invincibility would become their greatest weakness once it was broken. To achieve this, Wellington planned not just to defeat the Imperial Guard, but to annihilate them so completely that their destruction would be visible to both armies. The psychological impact of seeing the invincible Guard broken would cascade through the entire French army. Wellington's choice of battlefield position at Waterloo demonstrated his tactical genius. The reverse slope defense meant that French forces advancing up the ridge would be unable to see the full extent of British preparations until they were committed to the attack. When the Imperial Guard began their final advance, they would see only the ridge line ahead of them. They wouldn't see the carefully positioned British squares until they crested the ridge, at which point they would discover they had marched into a killing field with nowhere to retreat. This wasn't just defensive positioning, it was a trap specifically designed to maximize casualties among elite French troops. The morning of June 18, 1815, dawned gray and miserable across the Belgian countryside. Heavy rains the previous night had turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire, delaying Napoleon's planned early morning attack. This delay would prove crucial. It gave Blücher's Prussians additional time to recover from their defeat at Ligny and begin their march toward the battlefield. But as the morning mist cleared, the true magnitude of what was about to unfold became apparent to both armies. This wasn't going to be another typical Napoleonic battle where tactical brilliance and the commitment of the Guard would secure victory. This was going to be a grinding, brutal test of endurance. Exactly the kind of battle that favored Wellington's defensive system over Napoleon's offensive genius. The French army that deployed across from Wellington's Ridge represented the last great gathering of Napoleonic military power. Nearly 72,000 men, including veterans of every major campaign of the past 15 years. At their center, occupying the position of honor, stood the Imperial Guard in all their magnificent glory. The sight must have been absolutely breathtaking. 15,000 of Europe's finest soldiers, their uniforms immaculate despite the muddy conditions, their weapons gleaming, their formations perfect. At their head rode Napoleon himself, still only 45 years old, still radiating the charisma and confidence that had conquered a continent. But across the valley, Wellington's army waited with the patience of professional soldiers who had learned their trade in the harsh school of the Peninsular War. These men had broken French armies before. Today, they would break the finest French army that had ever taken the field. Napoleon's battle plan for Waterloo was typically aggressive but fatally flawed by his underestimation of British defensive capabilities. The Emperor intended to pin Wellington's army in place with frontal attacks while simultaneously preventing Prussian reinforcement. Once the Allied line was weakened, he would commit the Imperial Guard in a decisive attack that would shatter enemy resistance and win the battle. It was a plan that had worked dozens of times before. It would not work today. The first phase of the battle began around 11:30 a.m. with a massive French artillery bombardment designed to soften Wellington's positions. 80 guns, one of the largest concentrations of artillery Napoleon had ever assembled, poured shot and shell onto the Allied ridge. But Wellington's reverse slope positioning minimized the effectiveness of the bombardment. Most of the French shot passed harmlessly over the heads of British infantry sheltering behind the ridgeline. When the guns did find their mark, disciplined British and German troops maintained their positions with the stoicism that had become their trademark. From their position in reserve, the Imperial Guard watched the opening phases of the battle with professional interest. These were veterans who had seen artillery bombardments before, far larger ones during the great battles of the past decade. They had confidence that their emperor's tactical genius would soon create the opportunity for their decisive intervention. They were about to learn that this battle would be different from all the others. The first major French assault came against the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont on Wellington's right flank. This wasn't intended as the main attack. It was designed to draw British reserves away from the center where Napoleon planned to commit the Guard. But what was supposed to be a diversionary attack became a grinding, brutal struggle that consumed French troops and resources throughout the entire battle. The defense of Hougoumont demonstrated everything that made British defensive tactics so effective against French offensive systems. A relatively small force of British guards and light infantry, fighting from prepared positions with abundant ammunition and clear fields of fire, held off repeated attacks by vastly superior French forces. The lesson wasn't lost on Wellington or his subordinate commanders. If British troops fighting defensively could hold off the best French line infantry, what would happen when those same defensive principles were applied against the Imperial Guard? Around 1:00 p.m., Napoleon launched his main infantry assault against Wellington's center. For divisions of French infantry, approximately 16,000 men, advanced up the muddy slope toward the Allied positions. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were veterans of multiple campaigns, men who had proven themselves in dozens of battles across Europe. They were also walking into one of the most perfectly executed defensive actions in military history. Wellington had positioned his troops with mathematical precision. British and German infantry were formed in battalion squares on the reverse slope, invisible to the advancing French until the last moment. Artillery was positioned to deliver enfilading fire against the flanks of attacking columns. Cavalry waited in reserve to exploit any French disorder. As the French columns struggled up the muddy slope, they were met first by artillery fire that carved bloody lanes through their formations. Then, as they crested the ridge, they discovered Wellington's infantry deployed in line formation, the formation that could deliver the maximum volume of coordinated musket fire. What happened next was a textbook demonstration of why the British linear system was superior to the French columnar system in a set-piece battle. Each French column could only bring its front rank to bear, perhaps 100 men out of a formation of 1,500. But the British lines could deliver the fire of their entire front rank, 800 men per battalion. The mathematical result was inevitable. British volleys shredded the heads of the French columns, making it impossible for them to deploy from column into line. French soldiers fell in heaps, but those behind couldn't return effective fire because they couldn't see their targets through the smoke and press of their own men. Within 20 minutes, all 4 French divisions were in retreat, having accomplished nothing except the loss of nearly 3,000 casualties. But more importantly for our story, Napoleon was now committed to a battle of attrition, exactly the kind of battle where Wellington's system held decisive advantages. The Imperial Guard watched this repulse with growing concern. These weren't raw recruits who had been thrown back. These were seasoned French infantry, men who had won battles across Europe. If they couldn't break Wellington's line, what did that say about French tactical superiority? But the Guard's Real test was still to come. Around 4 p.m., Marshal Ney launched one of the most spectacular and ultimately futile cavalry charges in military history. Misinterpreting the movement of some of Wellington's wounded and supplies as a general retreat, Ney committed virtually all of the French cavalry, over 5,000 horsemen, in a massive assault against Wellington's center. It was a magnificent sight. Wave after wave of French cavalry thundered up the slope toward the Allied positions. Cuirassiers in their gleaming breastplates, dragoons with their flowing plumes, hussars with their braided jackets. the finest cavalry Europe had ever produced, charging en masse against the enemy. They were charging into another mathematical equation of destruction. Wellington's infantry had formed into battalion squares, the formation specifically designed to defeat cavalry attacks. Each square presented a hedge of bayonets on all four sides, with the rear ranks firing volleys into the attacking horsemen. The French cavalry could ride around the squares, but they couldn't break into them. For nearly 2 hours, the most intensive cavalry battle of the Napoleonic Wars raged across Wellington's Ridge. French horsemen charged again and again, only to be met by disciplined volleys and unbreakable British squares. Horses and men fell in heaps around the Allied positions, but not a single square was broken. By 6 p.m., the cream of French cavalry had been destroyed for absolutely no gain. Ney himself had had 5 horses killed under him. The mathematical precision of British defensive tactics had annihilated French tactical superiority. From their reserve position, the Imperial Guard had watched the systematic destruction of the French cavalry with growing alarm. The Guard included substantial cavalry formations of their own: the Horse Grenadiers, the Chasseurs à Cheval, the legendary Mamelukes. These were elite horsemen who had charged successfully on battlefields from Egypt to Austria. But they had never faced anything like the defensive system Wellington had perfected. As evening approached on June 18th, Napoleon faced a strategic crisis. His diversionary attack at Hougoumont had failed. His main infantry assault had been repulsed with heavy losses. His cavalry had been annihilated. Prussian forces under Blücher were beginning to appear on his right flank, threatening to turn his position. But Napoleon still held one card that had never failed him: the Imperial Guard. Around 7 p.m., as the sun began to set over the Belgian countryside, Napoleon made the decision that would define his legacy forever. He would commit the Old Guard, his most elite troops, his guarantee of victory, in a final assault against Wellington's center. It was a decision born of desperation, but also of absolute confidence. In over a decade of warfare, the commitment of the Guard had always been decisive. When regular troops had fought the enemy to exhaustion, the Guard had provided the hammer blow that shattered enemy resistance and won the battle. Today would be different. Today, the Guard was marching not to victory, but to systematic destruction at the hands of an enemy who had spent years perfecting the art of killing French soldiers. The preparation for the Guard's assault revealed Napoleon's desperation. Unlike previous battles where the Guard had been committed fresh against an already weakened enemy, at Waterloo they would be advancing against British positions that had withstood every French attack throughout the day. Wellington's troops were tired, but they were unbroken. His defensive system had proven its superiority over French offensive tactics in every phase of the battle. His men had confidence born from success. They had just spent 8 hours systematically destroying everything Napoleon had thrown at them. More ominously for the French, Wellington had been able to reinforce his center throughout the day. While Napoleon had been forced to commit reserves to stem the Prussian advance on his right flank, Wellington had been able to concentrate his best troops exactly where he expected Napoleon's final attack. The Guard would not be attacking weakened British formations scattered across the battlefield. They would be advancing against concentrated British strength deployed in depth and waiting for them. Napoleon personally briefed the Guard commanders on their mission. They were to advance in column up the center of Wellington's position, deploy into line once they had broken through the first British positions, then roll up the Allied line from the center. It was a mission that required tactical perfection, absolute coordination, and more than a little luck. What it would encounter instead was the most sophisticated defensive system the world had ever seen, manned by troops who had spent the entire day proving their superiority over French offensive tactics. Around 7:30 p.m., the most elite troops in Napoleon's army began their advance. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 1st Grenadiers Alpide led the assault, followed by the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 1st Chasseurs Alpide. Behind them came the Middle Guard regiments that would exploit success and complete the breakthrough. These were the men who had never known defeat. Veterans of Austerlitz and Wagram, survivors of Moscow and Leipzig, winners of 100 battles across 2 decades of continuous warfare. They advanced with the confidence born from absolute success, their bearskin caps making them appear like giants in the gathering dusk. They were marching toward their destruction. Wellington's response to Napoleon's commitment of the Guard revealed the systematic planning that characterized his entire defensive system. Rather than wait passively for the French attack, Wellington had prepared a reception that would maximize British advantages and French disadvantages. The 1st Foot Guards, Wellington's own elite infantry, were positioned directly in the path of the French advance, lying down behind the ridgeline to minimize casualties from French artillery fire. Behind them, additional British battalions were formed in line to provide supporting fire. To their flanks, more British squares waited to deliver enfilading fire against the attacking columns. Most importantly, Wellington had positioned his troops so that the Guard would face the maximum volume of coordinated firepower at the crucial moment when they crested the ridge and attempted to deploy from column into line formation. The Guard's advance up the slope was magnificent to witness. These were the finest soldiers Europe had produced, advancing with perfect discipline despite the mud, the artillery fire, and the growing darkness. Their uniforms were immaculate, their formations precise, their confidence absolute. Behind them, the entire French army watched in anticipation. Every French soldier knew that when the Guard advanced, victory followed. The sight of those towering bearskin caps moving steadily forward had always been the signal that the battle was won. Not today. As the leading elements of the Guard crested Wellington's ridge, they met a sight that must have been absolutely stunning. Instead of the scattered, weakened British formations they expected to find, they discovered fresh British troops formed in perfect line formation and waiting for them. General Maitland, commanding the 1st Foot Guards, had kept his men lying down until the last possible moment. As the French Guard crested the ridge, Maitland gave the order that echoed across the battlefield. "Now, Maitland, now's your time. Up, Guards, and at them." 1,500 British Guardsmen rose as one man and delivered a devastating volley at point-blank range into the head of the French column. The effect was catastrophic. The leading ranks of Napoleon's most elite troops simply ceased to exist, blown away by the concentrated fire of Wellington's best infantry. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical destruction. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard had been stopped cold by enemy fire. But Wellington's trap was far more sophisticated than a single volley. As the Guard recoiled from the first British attack, they found themselves caught in a crossfire from multiple directions. British battalions on their flanks delivered enfilading fire that carved bloody lanes through the French formations. Artillery positioned throughout Wellington's line poured canister shot into the masses of French troops. The Guard tried to deploy from column to line, the tactical maneuver that would allow them to bring their full firepower to bear against the British positions. But they couldn't complete the maneuver under the intensity of British fire. Men fell faster than the formations could adjust, creating confusion and disorder in troops who had never experienced anything like it. For the first time in their existence, the Imperial Guard was not just losing a battle, they were being systematically destroyed. The psychological impact of the Guard's repulse cascaded through both armies like lightning. French soldiers who had watched the advance with confident anticipation suddenly saw their most elite troops reeling backward in disorder. The sight was literally unthinkable. The Guard didn't retreat, the Guard didn't fail, the Guard had never been defeated. But they were being defeated now, and the effect on French morale was catastrophic. Wellington, with the tactical genius that had made him Napoleon's equal, immediately recognized the decisive moment. The sight of the Guard in retreat had paralyzed the French army with shock. Now was the time to transform defense into attack and complete the destruction of Napoleon's military power. Wellington personally rode to different points along his line, giving the order for a general advance. Tired British troops who had spent the entire day defending their positions suddenly found themselves attacking a demoralized enemy. The psychological tables had been completely turned. Now it was the British who had momentum, confidence, and the initiative. The collapse of the French army was as swift as it was complete. Units that had fought magnificently throughout the day suddenly found themselves surrounded by routing comrades and British troops advancing on all sides. Discipline disintegrated, formations broke apart, and what had been Napoleon's last great army became a fleeing mob. But for our story, the most important element was the fate of the Imperial Guard itself. Those units that had not been caught in the initial assault found themselves fighting desperate rearguard actions to cover the retreat of the rest of the army. It was a mission they carried out with the professionalism that had always characterized their service. But it was a mission that completed their destruction. The first chasseurs à pied formed into a square near the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte, fought until they were virtually annihilated by British cavalry and artillery. The 2nd Grenadiers, attempting to hold the crossroads at Plancenoit against advancing Prussians, were overwhelmed and scattered. One by one, the elite battalions of the Imperial Guard were hunted down and destroyed. By nightfall on June 18, 1815, the most elite military force Europe had ever seen had been effectively annihilated. Of the roughly 4,000 men of the Old Guard who had begun the day, fewer than 1,000 remained in any kind of organized formation. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or scattered across the Belgian countryside. The forbidden truth that European powers would later try to suppress was the systematic nature of the Guard's destruction. This wasn't the result of tactical mistakes or bad luck. This was the product of a military system specifically designed to destroy French tactical superiority. Wellington had spent years studying French methods, identifying their weaknesses, and developing countermeasures. The Imperial Guard hadn't just lost a battle, they had been outmatched by a superior military system. The immediate aftermath of Waterloo revealed the true magnitude of what had occurred. Napoleon himself, watching the destruction of his last reserves, reportedly said, "La Garde recule." The Guard retreated. It was an admission that his reign was over, that the military genius that had conquered Europe had finally met its match. But the real significance went far beyond Napoleon's personal fate. The destruction of the Imperial Guard had shattered the myth of French military invincibility that had dominated European warfare for over 2 decades. The psychological impact would influence European politics and military thinking for generations. More immediately, the survivors of the Guard found themselves facing a new reality. These men who had never experienced defeat, who had considered themselves the finest soldiers in the world, had been comprehensively outfought by British troops using tactics that emphasized systematic coordination over individual brilliance. The scattered remnants of the Guard attempted to regroup during the retreat from Waterloo, but they were no longer the elite force that had marched into Belgium just 4 days earlier. Their aura of invincibility had been destroyed along with their formations. They were simply tired, beaten soldiers trying to escape capture. Many didn't make it. British and Prussian cavalry pursued the retreating French with ruthless efficiency, and the Guard's distinctive uniforms made them priority targets. Men who had survived the retreat from Moscow and the battles of 1813 to 1814 were cut down on muddy Belgian roads by enemy horsemen who recognized the propaganda value of killing Napoleon's elite troops. The few organized units that reached France found a country that no longer believed in Napoleon's military genius. The news of the Guard's destruction had preceded them, and with it the realization that the emperor was no longer invincible. Within days, Napoleon would abdicate for the second and final time. But the impact of Waterloo went far beyond the immediate political consequences. The battle had demonstrated that systematic military organization could defeat individual excellence, that proper training and coordination could overcome tactical brilliance, that industrial military methods were superior to traditional approaches. Wellington's victory at Waterloo wasn't just the defeat of Napoleon. It was the triumph of a new way of warfare that would dominate military thinking for the next century. The British system that had destroyed the Imperial Guard would become the model for European military development, emphasizing professional training, systematic coordination, and technological innovation over the personal leadership that had characterized Napoleonic warfare. The destruction of the Imperial Guard also marked the end of an era in European military history. These men had represented the last flowering of revolutionary military culture, where common soldiers could rise to positions of honor and influence through merit rather than birth. Their defeat represented the victory of established order over revolutionary change. In the years that followed Waterloo, the surviving members of the Guard were scattered across Europe and the wider world. Some found service in foreign armies, carrying their expertise to places as distant as South America and the Ottoman Empire. Others retired to civilian life, their military careers ended by the destruction of the force that had given their lives meaning. But perhaps most tragically, many simply faded into obscurity. These men who had once been the toast of Europe, who had been personally known to Napoleon himself, who had participated in some of the greatest military campaigns in history, found themselves forgotten casualties of a changing world. The British, meanwhile, had learned valuable lessons from their systematic destruction of the Imperial Guard. The tactics and techniques that had proven effective at Waterloo were studied, refined, and incorporated into British military doctrine. The professional army that had defeated Napoleon would go on to build and maintain the British Empire for the next century. Wellington himself understood the broader significance of what had occurred. In later years, he would write about Waterloo not just as a military victory, but as a demonstration that systematic preparation and professional execution could overcome any enemy, no matter how skilled or motivated. The Duke's analysis of the Guard's destruction was characteristically methodical. He noted that French tactical systems, for all their brilliance, relied too heavily on the personal qualities of individual leaders and soldiers. When those systems encountered disciplined opposition that could maintain its coordination under fire, French advantages in elan and tactical flexibility became irrelevant. More importantly, Wellington understood that the destruction of the Imperial Guard had changed the balance of power in Europe permanently. With the myth of French military invincibility shattered, the other European powers could develop their own military systems without fear of French tactical superiority. The long-term consequences of the Guard's destruction at Waterloo shaped European military development for decades. The Prussians, who had been moving towards systematic military reform even before 1815, accelerated their efforts to create a professional army based on systematic training and coordination. The Austrians abandoned their traditional reliance on aristocratic leadership and began developing modern staff systems. Even the Russians, despite their victory over Napoleon in 1812, recognized that their military system needed modernization. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was psychological. The destruction of the Imperial Guard had demonstrated that military excellence was not the product of revolutionary fervor or individual genius, but of systematic preparation and professional competence. This lesson would influence not just military thinking, but political and social development throughout the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution that was beginning to transform European society would be paralleled by a military revolution that emphasized systematic organization over individual heroics. The age of Napoleon was over. The age of systematic warfare had begun. Today, more than 2 centuries after Waterloo, the destruction of the Imperial Guard remains one of history's most significant military events. It marked the end of an era in European warfare and the beginning of modern military systems that would dominate the battlefields of the next 2 centuries. The forbidden truth that this video has revealed is that the Guard's destruction was not accidental or lucky. It was the product of systematic planning and superior military science. Wellington and the British Army had developed a military system specifically designed to defeat French tactical superiority, and they had applied it with devastating effectiveness. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's invincible elite, the terror of European battlefields for over a decade, had been comprehensively outmatched by professional soldiers using systematic tactics. Their destruction was not just a military defeat. It was proof that the age of individual military genius was ending and the age of systematic warfare was beginning. The men who marched to their destruction on that muddy Belgian ridge deserved better than the fate that awaited them. They were brave soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns, men who had given their lives in service to ideals they believed in. Their tragedy was that they represented a way of warfare that had become obsolete, and they faced an enemy who had perfected the systematic methods that would dominate military science for the next century. The old guard died as they had lived, with courage, discipline, and absolute devotion to their duty. But they died as representatives of a military system that could no longer compete with the systematic professionalism that Wellington had perfected. Their destruction at Waterloo was not just the end of Napoleon's empire. It was the end of an entire era in human military history. This is the forbidden truth of Waterloo, that the most elite military force in European history was systematically destroyed by enemy soldiers who had perfected a superior way of warfare. The Imperial Guard's invincibility had been based on their superiority over traditional 18th century military systems. When they faced a truly modern military system designed specifically to counter their advantages, they were not just defeated, they were annihilated. The legend of the Imperial Guard ended on a muddy Belgian ridge, destroyed by the systematic application of superior military science. Their destruction marked the true beginning of the modern era of warfare, where systematic organization would always triumph over individual excellence, and where professional competence would prove superior to revolutionary fervor. The Guard had been magnificent, but magnificence was no longer enough in a world where systematic military science had replaced tactical brilliance as the key to victory. Their destruction at Waterloo was inevitable once they faced an enemy who understood this fundamental truth. And that is the forbidden truth that changes everything we thought we knew about one of history's most famous battles. The Imperial Guard didn't just lose at Waterloo. They were systematically, deliberately, and completely destroyed by a superior military system that had been specifically designed to kill them. The age of Napoleon was over. The age of systematic warfare had begun. and the price of that transition was paid in the blood of the finest soldiers Europe had ever produced.